WEFUNK. We funk.
Getting us to the 90s, where some really great fighters over the decade, of course, as well I mentioned earlier, but we could go to the X-Men, we can go to the X-Men, right? Not the Alien, but the Executioner for the first half of the great Bernard Hopkins career, who of course is going into the Hall of Fame 2020, postponed to 2021. But one of the inspirations for this segment here is Bernard Hopkins making it to the Hall of Fame in 2020. Literally dominated the decade of the 90s. So talk about longevity. But as well, a couple other guys that I've mentioned a couple times, but Oscar De La Hoya and Sugar Shane Mosley, two of the real superstar crossover, phenoms of the 90s. Of course, the great heavyweights of the 90s, Evander Holyfield, Lennox Lewis, all putting in work. But I guess the fighter that stands out above all else, really in almost in Money Mayweather fashion in a lot of ways, but just physically and fundamentally better than the rest. But of course, Roy Jones Jr., who entered the decade in January of 1990. Roy Jones Jr. was a blue chip prospect at the time, 5-0. All right. 10 years later, when he fought in January of 2000, he was, of course, by then light heavyweight champion, now 36-1. With belts in 3 divisions over the decade, of course, 31-1. That would make him, and of course, the one loss being the absolute bogus disqualification over Montel Griffin, who was on a knee, and Roy Jones, all shot there in a contested fight, ends up getting DQ'd. Ultimately, avenged the loss with a win in the rematch. But not beat, only beaten by himself in the decade of the 90s, as he actually won the middleweight title versus Bernard Hopkins back in 1993. Right, as well as a super middleweight title versus James Toney, among the highlights in the decade for Roy Jones Jr. I guess in another Mayweather comparison, however, and potentially the one black guy on the resume of Roy Jones Jr., but often accused of eating away at lesser competition, who stood no chance, while all along ducking the Celtic warrior Steve Collins, who really one of the great, truly one of the other great middleweights. And I broke down Steve Collins in my top 5 Irish fighters of all time, where he of course came in number 1. But and of course Steve Collins literally retired due to Roy Jones Jr. ducking him and stringing him on, claiming that he'd fight, that he'd finally give him the opportunity, and never quite did. And that really was not like there was a lot of great, middleweights, super middleweights in the 90s necessarily that you can really directly call him out for running from. However, always was the reputation that he was a little bit more of a businessman than a boxer in some regards, and set up a lot more exhibition style fights where he'd be able to dominate fighters with his hand behind his back, which was of course one of the most epic knockouts ever. And I'm using that to bash him right now. However, goes on the highlight of the resume for cool Roy Jones Jr. moments. But, just in a lot of ways, he was just, like I mentioned, physically and fundamentally just a superior boxer to everybody that he faced. So I guess in some ways you could maybe say a little bit of a victim of his own success, that he never really had that true, classic, definitive moments in some ways, all while ducking Steve Collins, of course. But really, you can say that he was ducking Steve Collins, or you can say that he was just that much much better than all of his competition. Either way, a little bit lacking on, the epic fight, overcoming adversity kind of moment in a career. But so far and away the best fighter of the 90s. He is my no-brainer nomination for the inaugural induction ceremony here on Big LW's KO Cast. Roy Jones Jr., the fighter of the 90s. Right. I guess getting us into the 80s, and I guess conspicuous in his absence, in even mere mention in my 90s breakdown. But, of course, by the 90s, Mike Tyson, although really you can argue throughout the 90s being the biggest, draw in the game. Right. But the true greatness of Mike Tyson undoubtedly was in the 1980s during what I like to call the Iron Dynamite era. And as I guess Mike Tyson as well had a little bit of a pretty boy Money Mayweather name change situation himself, but whether he was Kid Dynamite or Iron Mike, he absolutely dominated the 1980s, really both in-ring and out-of-ring. For inside, he was the unstoppable force that you tuned in, not to see if, but to see when he was going to knock out some hilariously undermatched white guy. And just watching white guys getting fed to the lions became a regular part of the pop culture life of the 1980s. And really grew Mike Tyson into one of the most famous athletes on the planet, and just the reputation, unlike any other, really in the history of high-level sports here in America, as he is just such a just defining pop culture force, part of the literally behind Michael Jackson, probably the biggest star of the 1980s was Mike Tyson, where the fights were the spread of pay-per-view and all that, Jack Dempsey style, but the spread of pay-per-view and the must-watch factor, as he just became a household name with just as like the scariest man alive, as the heavyweight champion really can get away with, and I guess in a lot of ways similar to Lawrence Taylor in some ways, who in all honesty was one of the other great sports figures of the 80s. But if you're a heavyweight champion or you're the linebacker of a football team, you can really get away with that love 'em but fear 'em kind of thing. And Mike Tyson really was, despite being a household name, he really was like a King Kong kind of figure, where he was just a caged animal let loose in the ring. And but in the ring, he really just deserved all the attention that he got, and really lived up to his hype throughout the latter half of the 80s, as well as he didn't make his pro debut until March 6th of 1985. All right, so not even fighting in the first half of the decade, but makes his pro debut in March of 85. By July of 89, all right, he records a first-round knockout over Carl Williams, making him 37-0 and a 3-belt champion in the heavyweight division, hot off a 6-fight knockout streak. All right, so just literally in from March of 85 to July of 89, so in 4.5 years, 37 wins, and a unified 3-belt champion. All right. By November of 86, even. All right. So again, March of 85 debut. November of 86, a year and a half later, records a second-round knockout over Trevor Berbick, a really good fighter, making him 28-0, and claiming his first belt. All right. So it took him a year and a half. He records 28 wins and wins his first title. A couple years later, he's got 3 of them unified. And like I mentioned, mentioned, just in the ring, dominated the sport as much as you possibly can. Literally, it's hard to dominate any more than Mike Tyson did over that span of 5 years in the to close out the 1980s. Okay, of course, like I said, garnering that just insane reputation, making him a pop culture a phenom, and I guess really by February of 1990, so after dominating the 80s, 2 months into the 90s, he takes his first loss to Buster Douglas in the Tokyo Dome, and within a couple of years, he would be in jail for rape. And upon his return, really never able to crawl out of that caged animal reputation. And of course, as we've chronicled, even on last month's top 5 WTF moments, but as we've chronicled, the fall of Mike Tyson happened over a long and sloppy time, between the mid-90s and the mid-2000s when he's getting face tattoo, up until the hang between pretty much between Buster Douglas and the Hangover. It was a lot of dark days for Mike Tyson, but there was always the days of Iron Dynamite. Iron Mike, Kid Dynamite, whatever you call him. In the 1980s, he was the most dominant force, and the Big LWKO cast, 1980s inductee, Iron Mike Tyson, Kid Dynamite.
WEFUNK. We funk.